Alright, everybody, greetings. I am obviously Jesus, and welcome to the third Patreon video for the month of June of 2019. And boy, am I glad I decided to do this debate coverage in multiple videos, one for each night, as you might imagine, because there is a fucking ton of shit that went on. The format was kind of chaotic. 10 people on a stage, you're gonna have people just talking over each other and, just trying to fucking get a word in edgewise. It was kind of disappointing in a lot of ways, and I really do think, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that they really could have pared down this debate. There were a lot of candidates, or not a lot, but like three or four candidates there who really didn't add much, if anything, to the proceedings. But yeah, I'm probably not going to be doing a whole hell of a lot of debate coverage as we get up towards the primaries. I just wanted to do this one first. Probably should have picked one later, but it's too fucking late now. I've already committed. But like I said, I'm not going to be covering any more debates or like every single debate until the field is much smaller, certainly. But this is kind of a unique opportunity, I guess, with 10 people on the stage over 2 nights, having 20 people. It's a unique opportunity for anything and everything to come up. So I was hoping that it would turn into something weird and wild. But anyway, I'm fresh out the fucking shower. Didn't really turn wet and wild, really. Or weird and wild, or whatever the hell I said 10 seconds before I said that. But yeah, I want to talk about, I wrote down essentially before going into the debate, I probably should have recorded it then, but I wrote down some of my hopes for the debate, and then we'll cover the debate itself and all the different topics. They did a nice job for me of organizing everything into different topics and keeping them all pretty tight together. So we'll go through all the different topics, and as I'm scrolling through them right now, there are a fucking ton of them. So yeah, I'm going to try to keep this relatively short and not elaborate too much on each individual issue. But yeah, we'll talk about the debate as it went, through all the topics, through the closing statements and everything. And then we'll talk about the outcomes and the format and what I'm hoping to see in tomorrow night's debates. So anyway, yeah, let's get into it. My hopes for this debate were pretty low. One of the things I wanted to see was that, Cory Booker in particular, the only vegan candidate out there, I wanted him to challenge the relative lack of veganism focus in the Green New Deal, which is going to be necessary in order to curtail the negative impacts of animal agriculture on the environment. But, even people who are really out there in front, like talking about the Green New Deal and being the really the ones pushing it, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Even people like her have gone on the late night shows and said, oh, well, you're not going to lose your ice cream, you're not going to lose your burgers, we don't want to take away those things. But the bottom line is, in order to affect the Green New Deal, I mean, you can take out, things, you can take on rather things like air travel, you can take on things like climate change in other ways, but nothing's going to change the fact that animal agriculture, unless we do something major about that and change Americans' levels of consumption of dairy and meat, especially beef products, you're going to have a real problem, and the Green New Deal has failed to address that thus far. I mean, it's not really a binding thing at this phase anyway, but the Green New Deal people, even AOC, are pretty fucking scared, essentially, to even make it look like they're thinking about taking away burgers and ice cream and all that shit. So I was hoping that Cory Booker would come out kind of strong on this and talk about the real realities of the fact that veganism has a place in the Green New Deal, and it is a fairly central place. But yeah, I did say, though, I doubt he will, since he's really close to big industries that rely on animal agriculture. Moving on to my other hope, Tulsi Gabbard, I hoped would be really strong on foreign policy and force candidates to address those issues. And I also hoped that, other candidates would challenge her when she tried to do that, as she said that while she is very anti-war, she's also quite, quote, hawkish on smaller scale operations to kill terrorists, which are often extra legal and saw a big increase under President Obama. And I've made my distaste for those, typically drone-led operations very clear. My biggest hope, though, was regarding Elizabeth Warren. I wanted her to come out extremely strong. Though I have no problem with a candidate, identifying like Bernie Sanders does with the Democratic Socialists of America. I was watching Colbert the other night, and Chris Matthews from NBC made a good point that Elizabeth Warren markets herself not as a DSA candidate per se, but a lot more as a reform capitalist, and really avoids that Democratic Socialist label. So she could really bring both sides together while still having a very progressive platform in that way. Her strength is also in coming up with real concrete policy plans, like Andrew Yang, who will appear tomorrow night in the debate. She has a lot more specifics than a lot of other people at this point, really, and I do want her to shine and bring out those. I think she will also or I thought that she would also probably shine in because she was missing her main competitors. Tomorrow night has Biden, the clear frontrunner, Bernie, the big, more progressive frontrunner, and upcomers like Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris. So Elizabeth Warren, I thought, could shine even more. Really, the only person on the stage tonight with her that could talk a big game and speak as well as her was Beto, but Elizabeth Warren has far more experience than Beto, so I was hoping that she would really come out and just trounce everybody else. I also, hope that if there's an opportunity that she would just fucking admit that she made a mistake playing up the little tiny fraction of her DNA that is, Native American, and just lets that issue die. I think it was crazy. If you remember back towards, before she launched her campaign, she put out this long video talking about, her Native American heritage and having a DNA test. It was a pretty clear telegraph that she was running, but I think that was just the wrong move, and she should have just said, oops, I fucked up. I do have a Native American heritage, but I probably should have been putting on that on any forms, considering I look like I look, and I've had certain advantages, based on being white. I shouldn't have done that. Oops, sorry. I've learned from my mistake. It's not something that I want to make a big deal out of, but she did make a big deal out of it as recently as earlier this year. So I hope that if I hoped that if an opportunity would have presented itself, which it ultimately did not, that she would have put that issue to bed. Although nobody brought it up in the negative either. So it's mostly a clean break. In general, I'm going to try in this video to focus more on the most likely candidates, as well as anybody who really stands out and goes above and beyond. So those are my hopes. That was what I wrote before the debate started. Now let's get into the debate itself. You could tell the format's weakness was time. They gave you 2 hours across 10 candidates. And they had commercial breaks inserted as well. They had to stop for technical difficulties at one point, which caused another 4-minute commercial break as well. So they lost some time on that. But looking through my notes here, you could definitely tell the earlier sections before they'd really found their pace and how, and looked at how much they were going to have to cover in such a short time. You can really tell that the earlier sections they allowed to go, the moderators being the they in that case. But yeah, let's talk about the first thing that the debate moderators covered, which is the economy. Warren's first answer, she got, I believe, she got the last closing statement, and she got the first question on economics as well. And right out of the gate, it was kind of a stumble for her because she ignored the question and avoided talking about why people, which was the specific question, why people, even 60% of Democrats, are satisfied with the economy. And she kind of just reverted to talking points. Amy Klobuchar, who got essentially the same question and got a chance to jump off on that, she came out strong with specifics in her first question by contrast, although I don't believe she addressed the core issue of, why people are happy if, Donald Trump really is fucking up the country economically in the long term. So nobody really did a good job on that. And Beto didn't really do any better. The man is a fucking walking talking point from the forced Spanish that he pulls out, from the very beginning, talking about how we have to come together. And he dodges specifics when he was asked about the marginal tax rate of 70% that a lot of people are proposing. I like his strong stance against PACs and money in politics, but he really dodged the actual specifics of the question. I understand that candidates don't want to get locked in, but even a marginal tax rate, if you're aware of the history of economics in this country, a marginal tax rate of 70% on the richest people is really not that controversial of an idea. We've had more under conservative presidents, so he really kind of flubbed that one as well. When talking about antitrust laws and breaking up big corporations, Booker handled the question pretty well, talking about, or when he was asked rather, about his views on the antitrust laws and his contrast with Elizabeth Warren on that issue. And he was accused of not being willing to name names like Amazon when talking about breaking up these big corporations. But when he was challenged and the moderator said, oh, you seem less willing to name names, he actually went out and named Amazon as a name. Warren just kind of went the talking points again. She didn't really contrast herself to Cory Booker in that scenario. So not a super really great start from Elizabeth Warren on the economic side of things either. Julian Castro got sort of a softball with, when asked about his support of the Equal Rights Act regarding women's wages. Tulsi Gabbard got the same question. And this was probably the funniest moment of the debate, or like the biggest gaffe of the debate. Tulsi Gabbard, after getting that follow-up to the, fairly softball question about the Equal Rights Amendment that Castro got, Tulsi Gabbard immediately went off about 9/11, joining the military, and basically gave her opening statement, even though the format clearly said that there were no opening statements, so she just powered through, completely ignored the question, and it was probably, like I said, just the most absurd moment of the debate, and really, I mean, I think she, spoiler alert, I think she picked it up a little bit later and got into her own, but really just the idea that a candidate would come to the stage so prepared, just totally defying the format and ignoring a fairly important question in order to talk about the fucking, her military service in 9/11, that was, to me, very, just very fucking weird. Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York, he came out really strong on the economic issues. He immediately supported antitrust and immediately said that he was in favor of the 70% marginal tax rates and free college, pretty clearly fucking dunking on the equivocating of Beto and Amy Klobuchar. Although these are pretty basic points to the progressive platform, it was nice to see him really get out of the gate really strong. I think de Blasio was probably one of the better debaters, if not the best debater in this debate, even if he's not my favorite candidate. And he knew essentially what to say. He knew what, Democrat and progressive leaning Democrat voters wanted to hear. And he really, really came out and came to the table with these things that are, still pretty basic to candidates like, Sanders and Warren, but he really took everybody to task when they didn't meet those same, basic low bars. Final point on economics, Elizabeth Warren's plan on green energy was really inspiring and fairly detailed for, a fairly early debate, and also a good corollary to the Green New Deal, which I don't think it was actually mentioned by name at all in this debate, which seemed kind of fucking weird. Although I will say a lot of candidates did, of their own volition, talk about green energy. But moving on, the next section was about healthcare. They asked who was in favor of Medicare for all, and the only two people who raised their hands were Bill de Blasio and Elizabeth Warren, and I'm glad they took that stand. Amy Klobuchar, in response to that, insinuated that those two who raised their hands for Medicare for all would kick people off their insurance, which, is technically in a way true, but it ignores the fact that Medicare for all will insure all people. Nobody will be without insurance, and Medicare for all allows you to keep your own doctor and still choose where to go. There'll just be no more insurance companies who are the middlemen. So there was kind of a whole running theme in this healthcare section that Medicare for all will kick people out of their, existing insurance because, that's technically true, but it's not removing choice and telling you what doctor you have to go to. Candidates like Bernie Sanders make that very clear. Elizabeth Warren didn't push back that much against this, but this was also the start of a pretty, disconcerting trend in this debate where Elizabeth Warren didn't get a whole fucking ton of time to speak, and she's not one of the big fucking loud, shouty people who just tries to insinuate themselves into every conversation like, de Blasio was doing that, Tim Ryan was doing that, Jay Inslee was doing that. She's not that type of person, and she kind of lost out in the debate because the moderators did eventually start giving over to people like Tim Ryan, who would really jostle for time. During this healthcare section, I saw Elizabeth Warren trying to raise her hand and try to flag, Chuck Todd and Rachel Maddow or whoever the hell it was at the time, trying to flag their attention, but she's not going to really talk over people, and that worked to her detriment here, which I think is evidence of a failure in the format of having so many goddamn people on stage, and the moderators failed as well by eventually, not necessarily this early, but they really started giving over a lot of time to the people who were the loudest in the room or the most demanding of it. And that really did a disservice to Elizabeth Warren because, as one of those people who raised her hand for, Medicare for all, she didn't get to say a whole hell of a lot on this subject. But yeah, Amy Klobuchar and several others made this kind of disingenuous claim that Medicare for all will kick people off their insurance. I think the person who played this kind of middle ground, though, best was not Klobuchar, but Beto or Rourke, excuse me. He played the sort of middle ground public option really well, and he did it while also making his goal of universal coverage clear. De Blasio challenged him on that, but I don't think the challenge was detailed enough, and he was kind of just interjecting, and this is where that started as well. Governor, I forget his first name, but he's fucking irrelevant, but the Congressman Delaney jumped on Beto's point as well. There was a big pushback against the idea of Medicare for all as a total thing, because even though, again, this is the type of centrist bullshit that I'm kind of fucking tired of seeing in the Democratic Party, I mean, it's a better debate to have, I guess, than, Democrats versus Republicans or progressives versus Republicans. It's better to have, moderate Dems versus progressive Dems, I suppose. But it's still kind of tired to have people on the stage not really being challenged by the moderators, insinuating that universal health care or Medicare for all is going to kick people off and they'll lose something in the translation when that is, not true at all. It is really good to see, I will say, that universal coverage, either through Medicare for All or a hybrid, where, as people like Delaney and Klobuchar and everybody else suggested, whether or not they were hopping on the Medicare for All train, or as most of them did, said, oh, well, people can keep their insurance if they got it through their employer and their union or whatever, and they like it. But if you're not insured, then you just automatically fall back to Medicare for All and we'll still have universal coverage. That seems fine, but I mean, it does seem to keep the insurance companies in a role in society that is just not needed if we have a single payer system, and allows them to profit and allows them to sort of fuck up and be middlemen and twist things to their way. And so a lot of people play the middle. Klobuchar was one of the people who talked pretty eloquently about how there is a similarity with everybody on the stage, where no matter what, their goal is to, keep everybody, covered, whether it's through Medicare or for all or hybrid with Medicare as a fallback. But it is kind of disconcerting that, the ideas wouldn't be challenged, that Medicare for all is going to take away your choice and not allow you to see the doctors that you want to see, because that is, demonstrably not true. They also talked about abortion, and well, when talking about abortion, it was pretty unsurprising. Everybody was, in favor of reproductive rights. I think the moderators even themselves said that, everybody on the stage supports a woman's right to choose. Julian Castro was the only one who got to speak who included trans people in abortion issues, and that seemed genuine to me. I don't think he's got a chance in hell of winning the presidency, but it's welcoming to see someone, nobody really jumped on that, but it wasn't really like they didn't really spend a whole hell of a lot of time talking about trans-specific issues, or really any. He just kind of brought it up, which was nice, but it would be nicer to see a bigger candidate like Warren bring that up. But Warren, when she did finally get to speak again, she just came out with totally staunch support of reproductive rights, Roe v. Wade, and that really strengthened her position, which I did like to see, because she did stumble out of the gate a little bit, but that was her first chance at recovering. Cory Booker did something kind of refreshing, and then he stood up to, Big Pharma, which is nice given his history of being in the pockets of big corporations. I don't know how genuine that was, though. And this is where it really just became immediately apparent that every time fucking Beto got a question, he started talking, he started with a talking point or some, cheeky little anecdote. I mean, he always would come around to a strong stance, and he did come around in this case to a strong stance on holding, Big Pharma to account. But the way he talks, Beto is like the most insufferable career politician, and he's fairly early in his career in that, and yet he already speaks like a fucking trained dog to just have a cheeky, cutesy little anecdote ready, or a poignant anecdote ready at the very least, for every single question he might be asked. And it was not really germane to his policies, really, but it's just annoying to hear that man fucking speak, honestly, if I may offer some personal commentary. The next subject that the debate covered was immigration. Julian Castro, as the only Latino person running for the office, got the first question. He said he was willing to use an executive order to stop the humanitarian crisis at the border, which is welcome, because while I definitely am concerned about the increase of executive orders through the past couple presidencies, and not necessarily even the frequency of the orders, but the scope of the orders more than the frequency, I do like the idea that, someone is out there willing to say, enough is enough. I will do whatever it takes to stop this humanitarian crisis in this country and at the border of this country. And his willingness to do that showed, earnestness and the idea that he recognizes both the severity of the problem and, what powers might need to be invoked in order to stop it. He has a good amnesty plan, and he got for one of the best quotes of the night, where he talked about not criminalizing desperation, the kind of desperation that leads people to the border. So we got a really good soundbite on that. Cory Booker started to fucking speak in Spanish, which I think he has probably even less reason for than Beto. But he got a good soundbite in English about not leaving immigrants human rights at the border. When immigrants come here, they don't leave their human rights at the border, which is really good. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't speak Spanish. Of course, I'm not. It's not like I'm being. My mother does this too. Like she says, when she calls up a fucking automated line and she has to press 1 for English and 2 for Spanish, she sometime in the past she said, oh, why shouldn't it just be press 2 for Spanish? It should default to English. That's not what I'm coming out here. I mean, but even these congressmen, and I guess there was one of the anchors from Telemundo there, but only one question was asked in Spanish, and that was later in the debate. So these guys literally just pulled it out. And I know that Beto lives on the border and Cory Booker lives in a fairly black and Latino neighborhood, but to pull it out just unprompted seems really politician-y and really cheap. But yeah, Booker did get that sound bite, and he was the first to name DACA and talk about protecting DACA, the Dreamers Act, and so he gained some points there as well. Bill de Blasio, though, and this was part of an odd trend of Bill de Blasio impressing me in this debate, if I have to be honest. I mean, it's not hard to impress when, fucking 9 of the other people on the stage, there's 9 other people on the stage other than Bill de Blasio, and only one of them, Elizabeth Warren, is a really serious contender for the presidency. So it's not really hard when, Warren and de Blasio are among that field of fairly non-notable candidates. But de Blasio definitely was one of the only people on the night who engaged with any kind of philosophical issue and talked about the philosophical issue of immigrant scapegoating. And that was honestly really fantastic to me that a candidate, it's so refreshing that, even among candidates I like Bernie and Warren, very rarely do you get into high-minded ideas and really philosophical adjacent issues. So Bill de Blasio's willingness to engage on the issue of immigrant scapegoating that Trump does was really it was really good to me. It was really something that spoke to me in terms of the tone and in terms of just having a debate about actual ideas and, not having them just be talking points. Like, talking points exist somewhere between specific policy points and, philosophical ideas. And they have, they're pretty lackluster. They have none of the strengths of either end. So for Bill de Blasio to go to the other end and to take out just a moment to talk about rather than specifics, to talk about a philosophical high-minded idea that is still very relevant, that was really good and really classy of him. That I really appreciated that. One of the first flare-ups of the debate was when Julian Castro challenged Beto on law specifics, talking about the specific section of law that was used to abuse and commit atrocities like we're doing at the border, where the United States basically has concentration camps now for immigrants where they rip children apart from their parents. It's not up for debate. That's what they are. So basically, Castro challenged Beto on the specific laws that he's not necessarily, really gung-ho to repeal. And it was really good to see somebody really, for the first time call out Beto's equivocating. And I'm really glad that the moderators let that exchange go for a long time. It's also good to see that making border crossing a civil offense rather than what it is now, which I guess is a federal offense. It's good to see that, making crossing the border and being desperate less criminal. That was a basic platform of pretty much everybody on that stage. So that was a good, commonality as well. And, sort of out of left field, because I don't really know anything about him, Jay Inslee's embrace of refugees and turning the tables on Trump threatening to send refugees to his state was one of the more inspiring moments of the immigration section and of the whole debate, honestly. He really, took... And I guess he's a governor, so he has the unique situation to do this. He took Trump's threat to send immigrants and refugees to his state and just said, "Fuck yeah, send them. They're what makes us great." And that was really like Castro. I don't think that Inslee has really a snowball's chance in hell of becoming the president, but it was good to see him adding on to that and creating that kind of inspiring moment. And I guess it's hard when there are 10 people on the stage, but I would have liked to see the other candidates grasp onto that more and really go gung-ho. And that's one of the few, it was a pretty reserved debate. There was a lot of talking over each other, but in terms of really, high moments or really big conflicts, it was kind of restrained owing to the, white bread nature of a lot of these candidates. But yeah, let's move on to the next subject. And this is where the debate started getting really compressed for time. And, each section got a lot less time than the ones before. They talked a little bit about Iran. Booker was the only one who didn't raise his hand when asked who would go back into the Iran deal as it was ratified. Although, he was smart to ensure that, he didn't get called out later by, saying, oh, well, it was more of a technicality. I wouldn't want to, go back in necessarily. I could potentially negotiate a better deal. So he handled that sort of ostracism kind of pretty well, although he really was the odd man out on that, which I think in the minds of most Americans won't help him. Weirdly, Tulsi Gabbard didn't talk about returning war powers to Congress despite being a congressperson. War powers got mentioned very, very much later in the debate. So that was kind of weird to see her not really, talk about taking the reins out of the president's hand and out of Trump's hands, considering she's generally the anti-war candidate on the stage. Like, that's her big issue. But there wasn't a whole hell of a lot of time to ruminate on that because the moderators quickly shifted the conversation to guns. Elizabeth Warren was smart to name the gun crisis and mass shooting crisis as a health emergency and focus on restoring the ability of the CDC to research into gun violence. She didn't really go into the details. This is something I knew before. She really talked about having a data-driven solution to the problem, and what that references, and I wish she would have talked more openly about this, but they only gave maximum 60 seconds to answer, and again, she's not really a person who can really just go on talking over fucking Chuck Todd and Rachel Maddow. She's not really that powerful. She's very, sort of reserved and dignified. But yeah, what she's referencing there when she talks about a data-driven solution to the gun crisis is right now, the NRA has lobbied lawmakers to make it illegal for the CD, or make it, banned for the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, to research into gun violence. And she, of course, is referencing, like I said, I wish she did more specifically and explain the problem in her short amount of time. But she's referencing, letting the CDC go nuts and see what measures are most effective to combat gun violence, and what. Whether it's mental health or, gun bans or buybacks or whatever, see what works. Although that's a more long-term solution than we probably need. We might need something a little bit more severe or a little bit more drastic in the short term, considering how fucking many mass shootings still happen. She did dodge the question, or the part of the question that was about existing guns, and her research-focused answer lacked specifics, although I'm willing to forgive that because really the CDC would be the ones recommending the solutions there, and of course they haven't done that yet. Booker's answer also lacked specifics, which is kind of a general theme of the night, especially in this section. Tim Ryan, who I forget what the fuck his resume is because he just kind of one of the white bread dudes who probably won't make the next debate. Although I will say it was nice for him to focus on mental health counseling around trauma regarding kids who are scared to be in school and kids who have survived gun violence. So that was welcome, but I don't think it was enough to make him stand out and to keep him really relevant in the race. In general, the questions, I think, from the moderators and on the NBC side of things didn't go hard enough talking about the real problems of gun bans, which is, of course, criminals still possessing guns if, people surrender theirs, how to handle confiscation or buybacks. One thing that did sort of impress late in this section, though, was Bill de Blasio, again, sort of being the only person on the stage to reference the issue of the police, and talking about how there needs to be comprehensive change to, the way the police interact with their communities. And this is impressive, especially considering he's the New York mayor, or former New York mayor. I don't know what his current status is, but it's impressive because the NYPD is a big thing. They're a big, cultural institution. A lot of white people like them. Pretty much everybody else doesn't. But, de Blasio is a white guy. It's fucking good to see him stand up and acknowledge the problem that, police, both in New York and elsewhere, have with communities, specifically communities of color. It was a little bit weird for him to do that, and he talked about having a black son and raising a black son in America, and this is something that, Anthony Fantano tweeted about during the debate, and, it didn't even occur to me, but yeah, it is weird for de Blasio to be talking about raising a black son in America while Cory Booker is on the stage, although obviously I think that comes from a genuine place. Like, I think that, he lives in New York City, his son lives in New York City, so he really does have to deal with that, and it's not like Cory Booker was chomping at the bit to, raise the issue of the relationship between the police and the people of color. So I think it came from a genuine place. Probably he could have made an overture to Booker to involve him in that conversation or what have you, but it's still a valid thing for him to bring up, even if it is a little bit weird for him to do so. The moderators then went to a very, very strange place, which was, the idea of nominating people to the Supreme Court. It definitely seemed like a dead end to go down so far as questions go, as if, Mitch McConnell's problematic Republican nature was going to change really based on who was elected. It really did seem, and this is one of the more disappointing areas from NBC's side of things, it really did seem like they were just begging the candidates to go centrist and say how they were going to make some kind of overtures to the Republican Party in order to perhaps get a Supreme Court nominee appointed somewhere down the line. So I don't know what the hell the logic behind this was, but it did give Elizabeth Warren, who hadn't spoken in a fairly long time at this point, a chance to be really ferocious and to talk about what the Democratic Party would be under her administration, which was welcome. The ferocity from her was welcome because it's fairly rare, but it was also kind of unspecific. So this whole section was kind of dead to me. It was very short, thankfully, though. They very quickly moved on to climate change. Jay Inslee, governor of some fucking state, his resume is really good, but he's really bland as hell when he talks. Climate was also something they didn't spend a whole hell of a lot of time on because there was a lot of consensus there as well. Tim Ryan chimed in. He had the most notable blue collar focus in this section, but essentially his shining moments here are footnotes to candidates proposing the same thing. Even just the candidates on this night one stage, like Bill de Blasio and Warren. Essentially, Tim Ryan throughout this debate came off as like Bill de Blasio light. Both of them were going after the Workers' Party, restoring the idea of the Democratic Party as the Workers' Party, as the Labor Party, but de Blasio did it fairly, better than Tim Ryan, and I'm sure Ryan will be forgotten. They moved on then to LGBT issues and civil rights. It was kind of good of NBC in this context to call out Tulsi Gabbard's problematic past as, having said some pretty not great things about the LGBTQ community. She did recover well, and so she, I think, sufficiently showed that she learned from her mistake, which is good. But, Booker fucking flexed on her, championing or saying, I co-sponsored the Equality Act. And Booker kind of flexed on her saying, so did I, and, I didn't do these things, and, he just generally made a better case, so I think he had a time to shine there. Amy Klobuchar also contributed something to the debate as well, in that she brought up voting rights and enfranchisement, which were welcome, and a first for the night as well. There was one of the weird things, though, was that there was no talk this night at all not in this civil rights LGBT, or not in the civil rights section, not in anywhere else in the debate. There was no talk about prisoner voting. There was no talk about felons regaining their voting rights. There was no talk of any of that. And to go back to what Amy Klobuchar said, it would have been nice to see, other candidates, like I said earlier in the video, jump on this idea of voting rights and, disenfranchisement and, voter suppression even. I don't even think suppression got mentioned by name, but it would have been nice to see candidates jump on each other. But the pace of the format really didn't allow other candidates to get their ideas out. And I think having really in situations like this, where even the moderators' questions are few and far between, the format really let people down here, and there was no comprehensive look at each candidate's policies on these things. Entire areas, subjects and areas of things like civil rights here just went completely unmentioned, and it was pretty disappointing at this point. And in a way, I think I wish I would have covered a slightly later debate, because the truth of the matter is that even when candidates really stood out, or they did something, or they brought up something, that wasn't mentioned elsewhere in the night, like Amy Klobuchar did here, and other people have done, before and after, and will do after, they didn't really have a chance to sit down and examine that, because, at 2 hours, 60 minutes a question, it went down to 60 seconds per question or per answer. And, it went down to 30 in most cases very quickly because of the time and the technical difficulties. So it was, the format and just the logistics and particulars of this put together debate thing on NBC was quite disappointing. It's kind of pathetic, honestly, that in America you run commercials during a presidential debate rather than give people more time to, hear each candidate's thoughts on the issue. At this point, they interjected with Lester Holt for a viewer question, the only one on the night, which seemed kind of weird. And the viewer question was about, whether or not we should intervene as a country in genocide. Beto got the right of first answer on this one, and he was sort of, savvy and smart, and actually, I think, morally right to say that we certainly have a role to play, but as part of a coalition of nations, not just as ourselves, not as the police of the world, but as part of something like the UN. De Blasio also in this section had the first of the night mention of the War Powers Act, which I hoped Tulsi Gabbard, as I said earlier, would have brought up in the section about Iran, or Iran, I guess. It's not, Iran is just what you say when you live near Boston, I guess. But de Blasio was the first one here talking about our intervention in foreign, countries. To bring up the War Powers Act. So, he did spend a fucking ton of time talking about his dad getting his leg blown off, which was strangely his really only foray into just the really self-indulgent anecdotes that a lot of politicians do. But he didn't dispute Beto's point, but it was really nice of him to, invoke an actual law like the War Powers Act regarding this. And that segment segued quite nicely into a section about foreign policy. And the first thing they brought up was leaving Afghanistan. And Tim Ryan, I think, this is probably what will ultimately lead to his resignation or his, not resignation, but his withdrawal from the race for president. He really showed himself to be a war hawk and a real centrist in the vein of Obama, because he wants to stay there. And I was waiting and hoping the moderators would not skip over Tulsi Gabbard, and they didn't. They went right to her after Tim Ryan said that we should stay in Afghanistan. We have to be there. And she fucking clapped back, as the children say, in a fucking huge way. She is a one-issue candidate for me, the anti-war issue, but she's so fantastic on that one issue. She really just said, she didn't say it in these words, but essentially she really made a very, very good case for, what I believe, which is that, if we, we don't have to stay there. We're not helping. The terrorists hate us still. We're not helping in any way. The idea that our presence in the region de facto, just by default, is somehow helpful, rather than harmful to us or the people around in those regions in the Middle East, the idea of that is not substantiated. And Gabbard gave him a fucking lashing on that issue, and that was really fantastic to see. They also did something that I wish they had done a lot more, now that I think about it, throughout the debate, with this goddamn many fucking people on the stage. They did like a lightning round, 1 or 2 word answers, just going down. And in this case, they asked people what, in 1 or 2 words, is the largest threat to America right now. A surprising number of the Democrats fell into the Trump idea of China phobia and worried about China's economic threat to us. But, once we hit Beto and Elizabeth Warren, they instead said climate change. And there were a number of people, including, I believe, Cory Booker, who invoked the threat of nuclear proliferation, which is still an ever-present threat and could be, in the hands of someone like Trump, especially, what ends the world as we know it. And that gave me confidence to see, as people moved on and we moved down the line, that people were really identifying the global threats, the climate and the nuclear proliferation, as the real threats, and America's role in them, of course, is non-zero, and is, in fact, we're big on nuclear weapons still. We're big on pollution. So it was nice to see most of the candidates hit that one, in the 1 or 2 word answer category. One of the final thing they covered was the idea of Trump and Mueller and presidential accountability, and whether or not Trump specifically will be prosecuted. Beto, as always, went to some kind of stupid anecdote or symbol, but he did, as he does, eventually come around and get to the point, and it was good to see him float the idea of accountability for Trump for his crimes. Because they were so crunched for time at this point, it didn't really get that specific, but this was where John Delaney, or is his name John? I don't fucking know. The fucking guy on the far right of the stage, his name is Delaney. I want to call him Rob Delaney, but of course that's the fucking comedian. But Delaney Delaney's equivocating here is what he essentially used as enough rope to hang himself. I think this will be, ultimately his final debate, because he really just equivocated on this issue and gave deference to Nancy Pelosi, of all people, which probably turned off instantly every single young voter who was willing to give him a chance at this point, even though, and I didn't mention this earlier, but Delaney was like the most fucking demanding person, despite being one of the more irrelevant candidates, probably the most irrelevant candidate, or the least relevant candidate, I should say, on that entire stage, except for maybe Tim Ryan. Despite being that, he was like so demanding for time, and when he finally got some time on this Trump Mueller question, he just equivocated, said Nancy Pelosi knows what the fuck she's talking about, and that he trusts her. And he talked a lot about how nobody is above the law, but he talked about how, at the same time, in the same breath almost, how holding Trump to account isn't a priority for people. It isn't a priority for, his constituents or voters in general. And while that may be true, and even if that is true, how can you possibly then talk about how nobody is above the law? Why do we have to choose between prosecuting someone who did something wrong in office and helping the country in other ways? It was totally, like I said, equivocating, and just absolutely just enough rope for Delaney to hang himself, and I think we will be saying bye-bye to him very soon as far as his participation in the 2020 presidential race for the Democrats. At this point in the debate, really, like I said, the format really started falling apart. The sections had already started to shrink, and I do think, as we go into the closing statements here, that it really was just a fucking tragedy that we didn't get to hear a lot more about stuff like Iran, stuff like climate change. That whole Supreme Court section could have been scrapped entirely without any kind of detriment to the viewers in general. But yeah, let's move on to the closing statements. Delaney started as the least relevant motherfucker. He essentially gave a closing statement that was MAGA for centrists. Not a single breath was spent in his statement on anything that wasn't a fucking cliche. De Blasio went next. He focused on his resume. But like I said throughout this video, a lot of these issues are better represented just as well or better in candidates like Sanders and Warren. He did a really good job of hitting, even better than Warren in this debate, I would say, the idea of America as the the idea of the Democratic Party as the workers' party, and invoking that piece of history of the Democratic Party and wanting to bring us back to that. But policy-wise, everything he said was essentially a footnote to Sanders or Warren. Inslee went next. He focused on climate change in his closing statement, but it's weird that when he was asked what the biggest threat is to America, he didn't name climate change. He named Donald Trump, I think. I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure he was the one who said Trump was the greatest threat to America. But his closing focused on climate change, which was strange, but I guess it's good that he identifies what it is. Ryan went next. He said there's nothing worse than not being seen, in reference to American workers and the states that the Democrat lost, but it's kind of a funny phrase coming from fucking the most white bread guy on the stage, except for Jay Inslee, whose face is shaped like a fucking square, thus being slightly more similar to a piece of white bread. But he really just, like I said, strikes me as de Blasio light, with a workers' focus, but much less inspirational, much less seasoned, and, just by Tim Ryan. I don't think it's going to be someone who appears on a debate stage again. Tulsi Gabbard's closing was heavy on the symbolism and the loftiness and the ideals, although she did make a point to include the idea of green energy, which I guess was okay. Julian Castro had a pretty unremarkable closing. I literally didn't write anything else down here. I think he started with a family anecdote, which I guess would probably ring true to, Latino voters, or is it Latinx now? It would, ring more true to those people than me, of course. But other than that, it was pretty unremarkable, rather, and just dealt in, your typical, political anecdote, aspiration, cliche structure. Klobuchar focused on her electability and her ability to beat Trump. She was, big on naming Trump by name throughout the night. Her focus on electability, that was not that great, but her low to the ground sentiments were all right, although, they were mostly absent progressive positions that, younger voters would latch onto. Cory Booker's closing was very high-minded, but kind of airy and empty on, any kind of real specific or sentiment even. There was no mention of veganism or even the Green New Deal in this whole debate, for that matter, so just completely disappointed and didn't live up to my hopes, even in the slightest respect. Beto had one of the better ones here, very youth-focused, Warren, though, got the final closing spot of the night, and her anecdote was really perfectly tied into her political platform. I really think that she did something very good here. Nothing really exceptional. It was still that anecdote into policy format that a lot of people tried to use with varying degrees of success here and always have, but it was still very solid, and she had probably the best of the night, except maybe for Beto and his focus on the youngins. But yeah, nothing, I mean, they only got 45 seconds each. The format really failed here as well. So, I mean, they kind of did have to, I can't really blame them for hewing to that format that much, but still nothing really super great coming out of the closings. They probably could have fucking scrapped that entire section as well, because nothing of value, or nothing that was both of value and new, was said. So, blah. But let's talk a little bit more about the overall outcomes of the debate. It was confidence boosting for me to see a lot of issues be basic and standard across all the candidates. Like I said, they were pretty much all, on the same page with regards to the fact that climate is a big threat and we need to do something about that. The idea that, there need to be gun bans, the idea that immigration should not be a huge criminal offense, it should be a civil issue. The idea that no matter how we do it, there should be universal health care. There was a lot of consensus, even if the specifics of the proposals differed, which is pretty good, and it definitely seemed like we've moved in a progressive direction in that. And that gives me a lot of confidence. As for Elizabeth Warren, she didn't really shine as much as I'd hoped. She gets really stuck, I think, on the talking points, and basically seemed to think that, especially earlier in the debate, she could get away with not directly addressing the specifics of the question, but she's really not that savvy, so she really couldn't, at least in my mind. The questions weren't really gotcha questions on specifics either, so it's not as if the moderators were really being unfair to her. So I think she definitely, as I said, stumbled out of the gate. As I've been hinting at, throughout this video, de Blasio came out a lot stronger than I expected, although he's also mostly, a footnote to Sanders and Warren, and I don't actually know anything about his actual record in New York. He seemed to not be considered that progressive before now. It's not like anybody ever mentioned Bill de Blasio and super progressivism or democratic socialism in the same breath, like they did with Warren and even more so Sanders. So, I didn't, it's not like you look at New York City and see a progressive bastion, because it's one of the, as the moderators themselves said, most wealth-gapped cities in the entire country. So while Bill de Blasio knows the right things to say, I don't know if his record actually suggests that he would achieve it. And in the end, while I certainly consider him and have more respect for him than I did before, and I really now know what he stands for, or at least claims to stand for, I wouldn't really say that he could, possibly even dethrone Sanders for me. I just don't think that's possible. As for who will make it to the next debate, as I said, Delaney, Ryan, and Inslee probably won't make it. Delaney is almost certainly guaranteed to be the first to go. Just completely an unlikable fucking guy, overestimates his relevance, and he's just, he's Biden light, essentially, I guess. Inslee, I think, could maybe hang on to one more potential debate and show up one more time, even if he looks like a human fucking cinder block. I think Gabbard, Castro, de Blasio, and Klobuchar had strong enough showings that I think we'll see them at least one more time in another debate. Like I said, I won't be covering every single fucking debate, but I think we will benefit from seeing those guys again. I'm not really hot on Klobuchar. I don't think she really brings that much. She kind of has like that sort of weird Carly Fiorina, business kind of low to the ground appeal, but I think that even de Blasio does that better by invoking the idea of the working party as the Democratic Party. So I think Klobuchar could probably be chopped off that, but I think I would like to see Gabbard, Castro, and de Blasio stay in, and in a smaller debate field, I hope they could pull out, more lengthy, especially with de Blasio, ideologically driven conversations with candidates like Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg, and maybe even, make Joe Biden have a fucking original thought that didn't originate in Barack Obama's head. But that would be nice. I do wish we could have seen de Blasio and even Tulsi Gabbard on the same stage with those candidates I just mentioned. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the debate. Format, I want to give some thoughts on before we end here. The idea of having no opening statements, which they didn't have, that's good. Those would be just talking points anyway. Like we saw, as I said, Tulsi Gabbard fail in that respect, which was clearly the biggest gaffe of the debate, except for maybe the de Blasio race thing. I think they definitely should have pared it down a bit. It would have been very, very nice to see even just Biden, Warren, and Sanders interacting, and Buttigieg as well, because I don't think Buttigieg has a real chance of winning the presidency. I cannot possibly imagine the first couples, half of the first couple being named Chasen, which is the name your parents give you when you live in the Midwest and you really, really don't want your kid to be gay, I guess. They just named him the poor man Chasen. But yeah, I don't think we'll be seeing President Buttigieg, but it would have been nice to see him as kind of like this weird rising star, or Kamala Harris, who is occupying that same thing from the female perspective as well. Would have liked to see Warren on the second night, and you could have thrown in some fucking forgetful, or forgettable person like, Andrew Yang in here as well. Honestly, that would have been a really fucking good switch. Warren in the second night of the debates with the big boys, and Andrew Yang, who could have stood out even more among the kind of pretenders like Booker and Beto, and then just the total forgettable people who, made up most of the rest of that stage, except for maybe Bill de Blasio. That would have been a really fucking good swap. Yeah, Warren for Yang would have been a fantastic swap, and it's NBC's loss that they didn't do it. Hire me, motherfuckers. Yeah, the format really also meant there was not a lot of time for moderators to challenge people dodging the question. They gave up really quick on that. They tried it with Elizabeth Warren. They tried it with Beto on the marginal tax rate question, but then they really gave up and just gave it in the time crunch. And honestly, regarding Warren as well, there were massive stretches and entire issues and sections that went without Warren getting to speak even once, even briefly for like 10 or 30 seconds or something like that. And while that could be accepted for a candidate, like a fringe candidate like Ryan or Inslee or Delaney, how do you justify that with the clear front runner on that stage? They obviously knew she was the front runner for that night, certainly, but because they gave her the final closing statement spot. But there were entire stretches of time where she didn't even get to speak. And like I said, it really was not very kind to her, because she's not going to be that rude person who's talking over everybody else. She really was just passive in that way and sort of dignified. And I think that's part of the strength of her character, honestly, that she's very composed and stands in stark contrast to Trump in terms of her composure. But the debate format didn't allow that to shine. That's kind of a fucking disservice to her, considering she is the clear front runner on that stage. And that kind of pissed me off. As for tomorrow's vid, in the format of that, there will be a little bit less on policy issues, because I can imagine that a lot is going to get repeated. But I will hopefully have a lot more to say about the ways in which Bernie Sanders and hopefully Pete Buttigieg roast Biden for his history, his centrism, and if I can think of it, and if it's not too much of a Herculean task, I'll try to keep a running Obama count for how many times Biden brings up the administration he served in. But yeah, that's night one of the debates. I'm obviously Jesus. Your music recommendation for the week is Caprice Enchante by St. Pierre Snake Invasion. Fucking amazing post-punk noise rock shit. Brings back the old McCluskey feel, and it's even heavier this time. It's fucking real good shit, and I hope you listen to it. A link in the description, or a link in the body of the Patreon post. Oh, and one more thing, my schedule is different tomorrow, so I probably won't be able to post as soon after the debates as I posted this one, so I will probably have the video of the second night up by Friday night, I want to say. Yeah, Friday night sounds about right for when that video might appear. But yeah, this has allowed me to save the schedule of videos pretty nicely. And this is a fucking 50-some-odd minute video, so it's not as if I cut quarters on content, certainly. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm obviously a Jesus, and I will see you tomorrow. Or soon after that, whatever you want to call it.